why we should be paying attention. Just kind of recap, just to remind us why this is such an important event that's happening in both of these conflicts.
Right. Okay, well, I say actually in both conflicts, it's not just they potentially will have a huge impact. They've already had a huge impact. They've already changed the world. And in the case of the Russia-Ukraine war, I think it's first of all, it's the failure of the West, of NATO in particular, to achieve its objectives. When they went into this war, okay, of course they're using Ukraine as a proxy, as we well know. They believed that they could bring about the collapse of Russia. It was clear. If you go back to the statements that they made at the time, there was a Munich Security Conference that I think took place just a couple days before the war erupted. And they knew what was coming. And they were giddy, with excitement about it. They felt that this was their chance to actually realize their dreams, which was the overthrow of Putin's government, the possible disintegration of Russia. It would be the taming of Russia. This is their dream. This has been their dream for a long time. And then, of course, they had their economic sanctions prepared, which they were clearly confident would bring Russia to its knees. Now, on both fronts, they have failed, and that is enormous. Just that fact in itself is enormous. It has changed the world because the rest of the world has looked at it and said, "Wait a second." Every country in the world was in awe of NATO and in particularly of the U.S. There's a sense that and of let's say the G7, which is largely consists of the same countries. They feared the economic power and the military power of the West, and they would kowtow to it. They would bow down. They would make all kinds of compromises of their own sovereignty. This was true of the nations of the world. And then they saw Russia. They saw that again these powers using NATO and then Europe and the U.S. concentrating, focusing all its economic power to destroy it, just sort of like a laser being focused at Russia. Russia is going to be smoking ruins, in economically speaking, and it failed. The military effort, that wasn't quite so immediate. I think that took some time because, again, a lot of people didn't understand how Russia went in with really a very limited force. And as Putin later said, they didn't even really have the forces to conquer Ukraine. That was never their intention. It clearly wasn't. So there was some confusion about what was happening on the military front initially. But it was crystal clear what happened on the economic front. And that had enormous repercussions. And now over time, the rest of the world understands, again, all these weapon systems that have been so hyped and that they feared, all of them are paper tigers, and this is what they see. And this has changed the world. So now you have countries like Saudi Arabia. Okay, they haven't abandoned the U.S., but they have fundamentally changed the position. They're moving towards the multipolar world. They understand that the U.S. is just one pole. It's no longer, though the U.S. wants to think of itself as the world hegemon, other countries don't realize that it no longer is, or its days are very much numbered, and they are already fundamentally changing their policies. So this is we go into other things, but I think that's right there. We can see the huge impact of this war, and it will continue, I believe, to have this impact as time goes on, and as Russia's military victory becomes clearer and clearer, with every passing month, that will again diminish the reputation of NATO in the eyes of the world. And again, that just fundamentally changes things, and it helps to give birth. It is giving birth to this multipolar world. So that conflict is extremely important. And then, of course, the attack on Gaza, the genocide on Gaza, that too has really changed the world. And that's whereas the Ukraine-Russia war really affected the two of the three pillars, the economic and the military. I think it's what's happening here is this war on Gaza by Israel with full U.S. support has fundamentally shaken the third pillar, which is soft power, is the moral power. because the U.S. is complicit in genocide and the world sees it. And so that too, right there, has had a huge impact, on the world. It's changed the world. And it has brought us, it is bringing to end the U.S.-led world hegemony, and it is giving rise to the multipolar world. So both of those conflicts are very, very important already, just for what they've done, and I think they're going to continue to have that effect. I mean, unfortunately, I'm afraid this genocide will continue, and it'll just be the final nail in the coffin of the U.S.'s moral reputation.
When you say that, the West at the Munich Security Conference, their goal was to collapse Russia, to destroy Russia, are we talking about a regime change, fundamentally change the government, not necessarily break up the country, right? Or some people maybe...
Well, some of them clearly had that thought, but not necessarily, to at least affect, a change of government. And they had this belief, which is just ridiculous, actually. Clearly, they just didn't understand Russia, that that whoever replaced Putin would be just much more compliant, like a Yeltsin all over again. And that they could, they could cause him to submit. He would be a willing puppet. And that, again, I think that was ridiculous. Anybody who replaces Putin, or who would have replaced him back then, I think would have been much more hardline. Again, Putin has been just really the epitome of reasonableness and caution. And again, within Russia, most of the criticism is coming from the hardliners and the nationalist side of the spectrum.
Right. So we always say that this war is existential in nature for Russia because of that. The goal has been stated. We want to bring down Russia, get rid of regime change. But the longer that we have been invested in this war with the West in general, is it becoming existential for NATO or the EU or Western hegemony in general? And that's scary, if so.
Yeah, I would say it's not actually existential for Europe or the U.S. They could just say, "Hey, forget it," and everything and everything would be fine, because Russia has no intention of invading. It has no intention, nor does it have the means, to invade and occupy Europe, or all of Europe, or a big part of it. That's just not going to happen. Much less the United States, which is way over there on the other side of the ocean. So it isn't existential for them per se, but it's existential for their hegemony. I think that's what it comes down to. It's because, again, their reputation, which has already been severely damaged, would be irreparably damaged, if there's just a clear-cut Russian victory, which I think is inevitable.
Right. I mean, I always thought, when I was surprised about the stance that Europe had towards this war. When Trump won the election and was coming in, I thought there would be a sigh of relief from EU leaders, like, oh, thank goodness, now we can get out of this conflict that we're being dragged into in Europe, because it's been horrible for our economies. We're becoming very unpopular. This is not good. This is not something we want. But then I was just kind of shocked that they were upset. They're like, no, we got to keep this war going. And I think that represents that these leaders believe that it is existential in nature. And that if they lose this war, of course, their political careers will be over. But maybe more so, I don't know if they're concerned about Western hegemony, or they're more concerned about NATO itself will be over, or the European Union, this project will be over. Do you think it's existential for those organizations, the EU, NATO?
Yeah, very well may be. I think what you said just brought to mind that scene of the organizer of the most recent Munich Security Conference, the one where Vance gave his speech. And when it was over, the organizer actually broke down in tears and said, "This is the end of the rules-based international order." And you can see that there is right there, you can see there is an emotional investment in these notions. And when you say the rules-based international order, you're really talking about Western-led hegemony. And so that's what they see as being threatened. He could see the end of it, and he broke down in tears. This is what they're fighting for. This is what they can't let go of. And the more that they double down on it, I think in the end, the harder the fall will be. If they pulled out earlier, say, this was stupid. It really doesn't matter to us. We'll let's just make this deal with the Russians. It's not, it's unfortunate, but it's really kind of a regional issue. It's between Ukraine and Russia. Could have done that, but they didn't, and they made it into an existential matter for not for their countries at this point, but again for hegemony. And they have stated that again and again. We just can't let them win. If they do, the consequences will be dire. And then when they win, where are they going to be? Maybe NATO will survive, but it clearly will be weakened. It'll be weakened in the eyes of the world, and I think of even the people in Western countries.
Right. So now, if it's existential for Russia and the West,
in different ways, very different ways.
Right, in different ways, but this is what makes the conflict potentially so dangerous, is that the longer that the West doubles down, like you said, the fall will be harder. They're making it existential for themselves. And it will be existential, I think, the longer they go on, for NATO, the more that they get involved into this, and the European Union project in general, Western hegemony. So that just makes me think that the only thing maybe potentially holding back an all-out conflict between NATO is really just the populations within those countries. They are the ones that have to rein it in, because they have to say, well, this isn't existential for us. We're not worried about Russian troops marching in and taking over our homes or whatever it is. But the leaders have made it existential. So I think that's the battleground that's going to have to be fought, right? Mm-hmm. We're going to have to see some type of change come from the populations need to rise up. Because as it goes on, these leaders, if they have their way, they'll make it more and more existential to the point where they're going to say, we send in troops, we send in longer range missiles. Now it's time for nuclear war because it's existential for us.
Yeah, well, they're already raising the alarm. They're trying to convince their populations that, this is serious. We're going to be at war with Russia. So far, the European people have not risen to the bait. I don't think you see a real major shift in support for, direct intervention in Ukraine or for increased military budgets. That's just not there. And in general, there seems to be a lot of anger in places like the UK about the focus on Ukraine at the expense of domestic needs. And I think that's what you would find if you look carefully at all the countries of Europe. So far it hasn't worked. These leaders, like people like Merz, are working hard. They're trying to scare their people, and maybe at some point they'll succeed. And maybe there may be some dirty trick like a false flag or something that will fool the populations. False flags have a long history and have often been used as excuses for war, as a casus belli, and they often do fool the people. So there's always that danger. They're not having success so far, but they keep on trying, and they have resources. They have dirty tricks. We'll see what happens.